All right. So hello, everyone, and welcome to one of our last Constitution Day panels. I'm excited to welcome four really wonderful, smart people here to talk about the vice presidential candidacy of Kamala Harris. I'll introduce each one of them briefly in alphabetical order, and then we'll chat for about 45 minutes about her candidacy and what it sort of means both in this present political movement and then a little bit in the longer historical arc of women in politics. So first, I'd like to welcome Mario Burrus. After completing an ethnic studies BA at SFSU, Burrus received the History Department's Distinguished Graduate Honoree this past spring. He completed our MA program with a perfect 4.0 GPA and earned distinction on his comprehensive exams. He focused specifically on African-American social and political movements in the 20th century, and he authored original research about the intersections between the Black freedom struggles here in the United States and global decolonization movements during the Cold War. So thank you and welcome, Mario. Below him in our Brady Bunch panel is Rebecca Eissler. She received her PhD at UT Austin, where she was a project manager on the US Policy Agenda Project. She has a very timely forthcoming chapter, an edited volume called The Unorthodox Presidency of Donald Trump, and that will be with the University of Kansas Press. Here at SFSU, she teaches American politics, specifically focusing on the presidency and Congress. So thank you, Rebecca. Her colleague, Amanda Roberti, is the newest member of the Political Science Department at San Francisco State. She earned her PhD at Rutgers with a concentration in women and gender studies. She has a forthcoming article entitled Women Deserve Better, the Use of the Pro-Woman Frame in Anti-Abortion Politics in US states, and that's forthcoming in the Journal of Women, Politics and Policy. And here at SFSU, she'll be teaching classes on gender and politics and the politics of sex and reproduction. Thank you, Amanda. And finally, Anantha Sudhakar teaches in the Asian American Studies Department here in the College of Ethnic Studies. She also received her PhD at Rutgers. She has published widely, most recently co-editing a special issue about queer and feminist Afro-Asian formations for the Scholar and Feminist Online. Here at SFSU, she teaches classes about Asian American literature and the arts, South Asian communities in the US, and Asian American women. So thank you, Anantha. So my thank you and welcome again to all four of you. Thank you for joining me today to talk about all things Kamala Harris. The theme of our conference is the unfinished work of suffrage. So while we've been commemorating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, we've also been talking about what so many marginalized and disenfranchised communities continue to do to work for equal and democratic representation here in the United States. And so, Rebecca, I'm gonna ask you the first question, and that, I mean, sort of very simply, why Kamala Harris and why now? Specifically, if you have thoughts about sort of, why Joe Biden chose her after a long delayed search for the vice presidency and what she brings to the ticket, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that was really interesting about this vice presidential search this time is that way back in, I guess this was early March, in the last debate that the Democratic Party held, Joe Biden announced that if he was the nominee, he would select a woman. So that alone was a really interesting parameter put on the search for the vice presidency that caused discussion about who would be picked to be different because, for better or for worse, traditionally the list of discussed names involves a lot of men, and then there'll be maybe a few women lately, but in the last few cycles, but it's been dominated by male politicians. And so the fact that going into that long period between March and August, when Kamala Harris's candidacy was finally announced, the fact that a lot of really prominent politicians just weren't even part of the discussion was really interesting. And so once that boundary was set, why Kamala? Well, I think the Biden campaign was weighing a couple of different goals? You know, did they want to try to appeal to a maybe more liberal part of the party, progressive part of the party? Age, Joe Biden knew that his age was a concern for some voters, so wanting to pick someone who maybe would be able to continue the energy in the Democratic Party. All sorts of different characteristics that made her, at the same time, because of her biography, an incredibly new candidate, someone that we've never had a woman of color in a major party considered so mainstream. And at the same time, the discussion is, oh, she's the obvious choice. In no prior election cycle would Kamala Harris have been the obvious choice for vice presidential nominee.
Mm-hmm. And Anantha, I was thinking that one of the strengths that when she describes herself and she describes, how historic and important her candidacy is, has been, she very much talks about that she's a child of immigrants and that she kind of lives and embodies the American dream. Do you sort of have thoughts about how she presents herself in this way and why that is a strength, how that appeals to sort of the way that people think about politics and American politics right now?
Yeah, I think that as a cultural studies scholar, that's been the primary thing that I've been very interested in, is this question of identity, representation, and all the discussions that have been happening, both within scholarly circles and mainstream media about, Harris's identity. And I was re-watching her acceptance speech as, I was prepping for this roundtable. And what's really interesting, talking about unfinished work, right? That's exactly what she opens her acceptance speech with, is calling up the generations before her, Black women whose stories are not recognized by history, but as she said, on whose shoulders I stand. So the thing that's interesting about her in terms of identity is if you track the way that she introduced herself, as it were, in her acceptance speech, is to foreground her connection to Black women's history and to Black women first. And then she introduced, right, I'm the children of immigrants. And I think that on one hand, that order, the South Asian feminist scholar Anjali Arandekar has argued that that order of thinking about Kamala as a Black woman with South Asian roots is very important because her mother raised her as a Black woman in the context of civil rights. So that's one aspect of her identity that's really relevant and interesting. And the other is that she raises this intersection of race and empire, right? That's her very being calls that up, because when she tells the story of how her parents met, it's during civil rights marches and during those fights, but they came to that civil rights movement in the US as children who had grown up in a British colony, right, in India and Jamaica, and who had been influenced by anti-colonial movements there. Mm-hmm. So I think the promise of thinking about Harris's identity is that it requires us to complicate our understanding of race in the US and to link it to histories of empire. So she kind of is a triangulated figure that brings in British Empire, US, Black history, and our contemporary moment. So I think that approach she took in her acceptance speech was really compelling.
Mm-hmm. And Mario, what do you think about that? Because I feel like a lot of the attacks are coming from outside the Black community, not inside the Black community necessarily, but there is, the same sort of criticism against Barack Obama. First of all, I want to get everybody's take on, this sort of questioning his Americanness, and now Kamala Harris's Americanness too, right? But then there was also this conversation that Barack Obama chose to be a Black American, chose to understand himself as a Black American. And now the same kind of conversation about Kamala Harris, right? Do you have thoughts about, you know, how her relationship with the Black community here as a politician in the Bay Area, or these attacks on her, you know, suggesting that she's cosmopolitan and therefore, you know, not sort of Black American in the way that people define it?
Well, yes, it's a pretty difficult situation here, you know, to obviously, you know, with police handing water bottles to white militias, you know, right before they go out and shoot Black protesters. You know, we're in a very interesting time in terms of, you know, what it means to be Black and what Black people are actually dealing with and stuff like that. Melina Abdullah made the distinction between being descriptively Black and then being authentically Black. And, you know, that's not to say that me or anybody else gets to decide who's authentic and who is not. It's just when you're, you know, in terms of being descriptively Black, we can talk about Daniel Cameron, you know, the guy who spoke up at the RNC. He's a Black man, you know, and does he represent Black people? You know what I'm saying? So with Kamala, in the Bay Area, obviously there's mixed feelings. Like even in terms of like being, so with authentically, it's like being unapologetically Black. And when she describes her childhood in the 60s, she's talking about the civil rights movement. And anybody from the Bay Area knows that, you know, folks her age don't really describe it even with those words. You know, it was a Black power movement, and she's not able to, you know, and I understand she's got to be political, but, you know, for Black people, I mean, I'm speaking for myself here. I can't speak for everybody. But, you know, and those who I talk to, those types of shying away from, you know, that unapologetically Black kind of, it leaves a bad taste, you know. It's just not, you know, doesn't seem so authentic. And then of course we can get into all the things she did while she was Attorney General and District Attorney and all those types of things. But, you know, I hesitate because I don't want to be too hard on Kamala, because she has done good things. And obviously as a senator, she has done, you know, she's been to the left, you know, but the thing about that is what's left or what's liberal to, say, the Democratic Party may be different than what is left or what's liberal to the Black community, you know. So I guess those are just my initial thoughts on her and that.
Well, and Amanda, I wonder if we could think about the sort of position that politicians of color and female politicians find themselves in, sort of being, I mean, number one, held to perhaps different standards, you know, that, you know, Bernie could say something that Elizabeth Warren couldn't, for example, right? You know, or Hillary Clinton could say something that maybe Barack Obama couldn't. And so, you know, in terms of Kamala as, you know, as a person of color or as a female candidate, are there ways that you see that she's circumscribed in how she presents herself, the policies that she's been able to endorse, how she has cultivated her image over the years, and how she is packaging herself now?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is definitely that kind of like double bind where they have to walk a very thin line of talking about identity, but not talking about it too much, right? Because then it becomes a problem, or identity politics or something like that. And you know, you saw it kind of, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton in 2008 kind of shy away a little bit from talking about their identities and their groundbreaking presidential bids, right? Like this is a huge deal. Kamala Harris has a little bit, although in her acceptance speech, it did seem like she was, you know, calling on gender and things like that. So it does seem like she's been, I guess, more comfortable with talking about issues of gender and race. She definitely has a tightrope to walk there. But yeah, her policies, I mean, she definitely brings up the work that she's done when she talks about being a prosecutor. She talks about prosecuting, you know, sex trafficking and things like that. And she does bring up when she's talking about Joe Biden, the Violence Against Women Act, and she does kind of call on those gendered policy areas. But absolutely, it's a tough one for politicians who are at the margins in terms of identity, because they don't want to be seen as isolating, even though it shouldn't isolate them in any kind of way.
Right. And I wonder, and maybe I'll put Amanda on the spot again here and then open it up more broadly. Do you think that there's more comfort having a woman and a woman of color be second on the ticket, not first? I mean, we remember that Kamala ran for president, right? And her presidential campaign really never seemed to gain traction. And I mean, a lot of presidential campaigns didn't gain traction, but she, just never seemed to be able to break into that forerunner group of candidates. So do you think that there's, as opposed to, say, Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016, seeing her as supportive, sort of second in command to Joe Biden, there's something that people feel more comfortable with there?
Perhaps, I don't know. It does seem like, I was just looking at some Pew polls for one of my classes, and it does seem that though the country acknowledges that, a majority of the people polled acknowledge that there will be a woman president in our lifetime. But only about 45% of them personally hoped that there would be a woman president. And then, of course, that was conditioned a lot by party. So mostly Democrats hoped that. So, the people who feel most uncomfortable with her aren't going to be voting for that ticket necessarily anyway. But yeah, I don't know. I do think that perhaps there's a little reluctance on the behalf of voters to vote for a woman candidate, unfortunately. So perhaps her being kind of second makes a difference. But I also think that, as we said before, given Joe Biden's age and the fact that he might only serve one term, does put her then in that position to be the next potential nominee. So.
Rebecca, did you have any thoughts about women being, there was a lot of talk that when Joe Biden picked a female VP, part of what she was going to have to answer for were some of Joe Biden's controversial positions in the past. I mean, I think of Anita Hill first and foremost, but also the accusations of Tara Reade. And so, that, Joe Biden sort of notoriously goes off script. Although he's run a little bit more of a disciplined campaign this time. So there's sort of a way that she is out there answering questions for him.
It's sort of interesting because I feel like there are two parts of this. There's the sort of generic, he has a woman as his vice president, in essence, endorsing him and saying, don't worry about those other things, those concerns you might have about his the way that he conducted himself as chair when Anita Hill was speaking to Congress, or the way he's conducted himself, whether we're talking about Tara Reade or just making women uncomfortable. There have been many other women who've come forward have said, he just made me uncomfortable. So part of her role, and this would have been whoever her who was vice presidential nominee, is to be willing to say, well, he doesn't make me uncomfortable. And so there's that aspect that is separate from Kamala Harris herself. But, I think one of the things that was really interesting is in the last few weeks before she was announced, there was a greater discussion going on of, well, it's not just that it should be a woman, it should be a woman of color. And there were a number of different really amazingly talented women of color who were discussed with a level of care towards, well, what could they bring to the ticket? That, whether we think of Karen Bass, who has been a very solid member of Congress, incredibly progressive, but in terms of publicity, a solid, hardworking, in the background member of Congress. Well, maybe that brings characteristics of safety that the Biden candidacy might want. Maybe, we want someone who can perform in the debates. I mean, I think a lot of people, I know myself included, the second that she was announced, were like, oh, I can't wait to see that VP debate. And so there were other considerations amongst the candidates. There was also a candidate like Tammy Duckworth, who's a woman of color, but also a combat veteran. And so there were sort of two parts. There was, what would any woman have to do as part of a Joe Biden ticket? But then what were the distinctions between the women? And ultimately, he settled on Kamala Harris. And I think it's really interesting that one of the reasons that was sort of given, although maybe not quite like this is the reason, was the relationship that she had with Beau Biden, and how that sort of personal linkage and trust between Harris and the Biden family more broadly seemed to play a role that maybe none of us were thinking about in terms of the political math of candidate selection.
Well, so Joe Biden promised that he would put a woman on the ticket, but there did seem to be a shift towards thinking about a woman of color in sort of reaction to the uprisings that have happened this summer and continue on today. And it's interesting because I had a conversation with Professor Postal in our department like months and months ago, and he thought that what Kamala really represented was a return to law and order. I mean, that's sort of like this very, her background as Attorney General and sort of the way that she conducted herself in the Kavanaugh hearings, very professional, very poised. And so, Mario, if I can put you on the spot, how do we, on the one hand, she sort of has this law and order rep. On the other hand, we have, Black Lives Matter and all of these protests about police brutality and police murder unfolding in the background. And so, do you think that is she meant to sort of speak for Joe Biden in this way, or is she actually sort of meant to be a reassuring presence because she's kind of more of this law and order, relationship with police and the legal system?
So I haven't spoke to Professor Postal about this, but I agree that, she's definitely seems to be somebody that would, kind of like not bring to an end, but like ease the tension, the racial tensions that are going on in the streets. And she's definitely, a law and order type of candidate. And so I don't want to go too far into all the history and stuff, but there's been some schisms within the Black community and Black political leaders in terms of these types of not only law and order, but militarism and from integration to, I don't even want to call it segregation, but just, socialism or capitalism, all these different things that have split, kind of the people on the ground, the people that are in the streets in Wisconsin and all over the country right now, and the political leaders. But I do feel that, Biden was doing very bad. I don't know. We all heard the comment about not being Black if you don't vote for him, but if any of you have listened to the entire interview that he gave on the Breakfast Club, it's like it was a completely different person. It was like somebody told him, "You're talking to young hip hop concerned." Like it was like his tone, and so he kept doing that, or just saying Black people don't have diversity, and all these things were really losing ground for him, within the Black community. So Kamala seems like a good fit. But in terms of the protests, this goes back to 1965, when the Voting Rights Act passed. 2 months later, Watts was up in flames. And the year after that, you had large scale riots in several other cities. And by 68, when Dr. King got killed, there was over 100 riots all throughout the states. And then at the same time, you had this split, where you had, Roy Wilkins and other people that represented kind of the establishment, on the other side of this conversation. So she brings up Shirley Chisholm a lot, and Shirley Chisholm, was the first political person who the Black Panthers endorsed, so that I don't see her really being so much in the same legacy as Shirley Chisholm, although, that's what people are saying. But in terms of quieting the protests that are going on, I think they're hoping that will happen, and it may. I could see us being happy, not just that Kamala is there, but just that Trump is gone, and then becoming content, and kind of like it was when Obama won, and we're just happy that it's not Bush or it's not Trump, and so we go back to business as usual. And the bigger question to me is the stuff that we're in the streets about going to stop? Kamala's the VP. I mean, I don't know what she actually could do. So it's obviously a lot bigger than her, but to even think that she can actually bring a stop to the things that are causing people to take the streets is just kind of naive in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, Anantha, I wonder what you think. I mean, sort of on two regards. One is, there's kind of a conversation about representational politics right now, right? Is that enough? Is it enough to have a woman in the White House? Is it enough to have a person of color in the White House? And then the second is, I mean, we're really at sort of a movement right now that's beyond formal politics, right? I mean, and so, can we narrow this conversation to a race about president and vice president? Or has this really sort of blossomed into something really much more broad, bigger, all-encompassing, that really goes far beyond the race for the presidency that will be decided in November?
Yeah, I was interested, Marian, in what you were talking about the distinction between being descriptively and authentically Black, right? And that's the big question with Kamala Harris, is that there's something powerful about the representational aspect of having a Black woman with South Asian roots as the VP candidate. But that leaves open the question of how committed her actual policy and advocacy will be in terms of being Black centered, right? And people of color centered. And in that way, I think, just to go back to this idea of you were saying about Shirley Chisholm being a kind of questionable legacy, to trace directly to Kamala Harris, and I agree. And I think that in that way, Harris and Obama, there's a kind of parallel there where they both are candidates that came out of a history, a generational history that can be traced back to these anti-colonial, Black power movements, but then in the way that they actually have come to be, they're more centrist, right? And I think that is maybe something to think about, what is in terms of our two-party political system, how much space is there for those kinds of movements to be fully represented and captured? And I think, Sarah, you're right. It's the movement politics, the grassroots movement politics are beyond the scope, thankfully, of what is captured and represented within the White House or within the race to the White House. But I think one thing is that, thinking about Harris's, questionable political baggage when she was Attorney General, and the policing and punishment of parents of truant children, that she's shown at least that she's able to be influenced by grassroots movements. So she has acknowledged quite directly that she regrets, some of her past criminal justice policies. So I think, that at least to my mind, that's something. It's not enough, but it's something, and it leaves open the door to see how she might be continuing in conversation with movement leaders, even if she is not, you know, the person who we identify as one of those movement leaders or legacy holders herself.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if I could ask the two political scientists. There's sort of this famous story that we tell in history where FDR is meeting with a bunch of labor activists who are sort of giving them their agenda. And he says, I agree with you on all of it. Now go make me do it. You know, there's this kind of relationship between, you know, how much pressure grassroots can push and how, you know, how left Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have been pushed. I mean, to think that, you know, Joe Biden is, you know, the 94 crime bill. I mean, you know, this is sort of, that was this man's legacy, and Kamala Harris, and now, you know, in her presidential bid, at least, she embraced Medicare for all. So, you know, what is the relationship between the ticket and the agenda that's emerging? You know, Harris wasn't the pick that progressives wanted. Obviously, Joe Biden wasn't the candidate that progressives wanted, but we see in their platform, you know, the Green New Deal and his partnership with the Sunrise Movement, you know, how are they evincing this pressure that Anantha and Mario were saying the grassroots are putting on them?
If I could start, so I think that the platform that has come out, which is more to the left than where Joe Biden was in the race, is important. But I think the really key thing is going to be the continual pressure that gets put on the presidency once, if they're in office, you know, once whoever is in office, because the thing that's really challenging about the presidency from a public policy point of view is the fact that presidents have to deal primarily with emergencies. So they may come in with a grand set of plans and strategies of what they want to accomplish, but they actually really end up accomplishing a very small portion of it because they have to deal with the fire in front of them, to use an unfortunately timely metaphor. Their ability to attack plans that they campaigned with is really limited, and it also is heavily dominated, at least what I have observed in my study of presidential decision making. It's heavily dominated with the policies and preferences of the president, not the vice president. At best, vice presidents are advisors. Sometimes they'll be given a small policy area to go off and focus on their own, but largely their position is either advising or it's ceremony. So to put too much promise on the idea that Kamala Harris's position will change what the Biden administration ends up doing, I think is to misunderstand the relationship between the president and the vice president, even when it is a tight relationship like we saw in the Obama-Biden administration.
I agree. And also I'd like to just reiterate, I don't think that Kamala Harris as VP would have so much institutional power, but she does have, if she were to be the vice president, she would have a bully pulpit. She would have more of a presence, right? A media presence, and people would be watching what she does. So in that sense, yes. On the social movements and the kind of work going forward, social movements who are progressive, who have been around for a long time, know that the work never stops just because a Democrat gets into office. If anything, it ramps up. And also a strategic movement would do something that policy scholars call venue shopping, which is basically just kind of not just going to the president with their concerns, but actually litigating and, taking it to the streets and lobbying Congress, and the variety of ways in which you can create policy change. So there are so many opportunities for those voices and those issues and social movements to keep moving the agenda left, it has substantially moved left. And that's been from social movements pressure. And it's also been from some politicians too. I think, Warren and Sanders have been advising the Biden campaign quite a good deal. So so the work is never done. They gotta keep going.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, I just sort of have two maybe more fun questions to end with. And the first one, I wonder, she's very much portrayed herself, and Mario has alluded to this a little bit, as a child of the Bay Area. I mean, famously, she used her story about Berkeley busing and the integration of schools to kind of swap Biden during one of the debates. So I don't know if any of you have thoughts about how she's a Bay Area child, sort of a product of local politics and maybe, sort of the local dynamics have shaped her. Born in Oakland, raised in Berkeley, becomes ascends city government first in San Francisco. She's a real product of these three really important cities in this really important time.
I mean, I'll try. I correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe she did leave, and move to Montreal at a pretty young age. So, but she's from the Bay Area. She's utilizing that part of her identity a lot more than I think people in the Bay Area identify with her. But I do want to go back real quick, sorry, to the grassroots pushing the politicians further to the left, because this is something that I hear a lot, and I agree that they're more pushable. But I guess where I'm troubled with this is that, the bigger thing is not just the Congress and the grassroots. It's with the people who the Congress represent, which is like the American people, and if the American people aren't ready to move to the left, then I don't, there's only so much that people can do. And one thing that Donald Trump has shown us that Obama did not was that, you can sway the people as that leader. He has found his base and he pushes them, and he even, so there's some things that those not on the, that the other people could be persuaded by the politicians if they would actually speak up on certain things. When we talk about abolition, we have to understand enslavement. We have to understand that, there was liberals who, thought, yeah, we want to free the slaves, but then what are we going to do with them? We don't want them in our neighborhood. We might ship them to Africa. And then there was masters who thought, yeah, we can let them have half a day on Saturday, so there's these people deciding for the enslaved what their future should look like. And the reality is, what the Civil War showed us was that nobody can envision the future better than the people who are suffering from the things that are going on. So right now people hear abolition of prisons or defund the police, and they don't have the language or the understanding to even grasp these concepts. But these concepts are not new, but it's going to take the American people to push themselves, and to be pushed by political leaders to actually make these types of change. So I just wanted to go back to that. I don't want to go on for too long, but I do think, there's a big responsibility on the so-called friends and allies of not just Black, brown, indigenous, immigrant communities, that the people in power do have a certain, that they can't just sit back and wait and just expect us to do all the work on the ground and push them to where finally people accept. The people, they have a responsibility also to, reciprocate that. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Amanda and Rebecca both talked about the bully pulpit. And I mean, if you've watched the RNC, sort of launch events for the past couple of nights, the portrayal that they have of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, has absolutely no connection to the reality of the platform of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And yet, here we are in the national public conversation talking about prison abolitionism, talking about defund the police, talking about the murders of Black and brown people on the street. And Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are sort of, are calling for investigations, you know, are sort of critical of excessive force. But in terms of, I mean, I think Mario's point of being willing to try and move the population significantly on these issues, you know, they're just not out in front. I mean, they're really coming from behind and almost in some regards playing catch up, I think, not recognizing where, you know, more, if not a majority, more and more Americans are thinking about these issues in critical ways. And I think that, well, I should say, many white Americans are thinking about these issues in ways that perhaps they haven't before. Of course, the people who have suffered from these injustices, as Mario points out, have been thinking about this for a long time.
If I might chime in with, I mean, I'm not talking to the Harris-Biden campaign myself, so I don't know what they're thinking, but I think if I were guessing as to why they're behind, it's because of the fact that our electoral system is not based on a direct popular vote. It's based on the Electoral College, which I mean, it's as if the Republican Party right now, with the way of demographics and the way the Electoral College will likely break down, that they're starting with a 5 percentage point advantage over the Democratic Party ticket. So while there are white Americans in some communities coming to internalize and understand racial struggle in a way that we have been privileged enough to not have to deal with, the problem is the election comes down to places where, again, I'm reading people's minds that I can't do, where those lessons are not being learned or not being internalized yet. And Biden and Harris seem to be making a calculation that if they want to win, and you got to win in order to do what you want to do, then they have to walk a finer line in the places that are at risk electorally.
Well, and I mean, Anantha, I saw you were going to say something, please.
Yeah, I was going to say, Rebecca, I think you're right. And as you were talking, I was thinking about, you know, the demographic of white women, which was given so much attention after the Trump election, right? That was in some ways surprised some people and didn't surprise others, right? That there was a disproportionate amount of white women who voted for Trump. And I think if I'm putting myself in the position of Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, I think in a way that's kind of an invisible audience that they're speaking to. And that actually, I think it's not that they are catching up, or I think rather it's that they don't want to go there, you know, like to win the general white female vote, which could be a deciding factor. They need to reassure people that police won't be defunded, right? Because I mean, that connects to like a whole racial legacy of the way that white womanhood is perceived as needing protection, right? From Black men, from people of color. And so I think that you know, complicated racial logics really informs how far they're willing to go. And I think, you know, if I visualize an analogy, I mean, I think they're pretty firmly centrist with like a toe out the door, you know, touching their toe out the door to kind of tap into a more progressive agenda that we see in these grassroots movements politics. But yeah, I think that to speak to that electoral college issue, I think it really limits them in how much they're able to push further left.
Can I also add, that's absolutely a really good point. But I also feel like they could and perhaps should be more out in front of these issues, only because, well, for a lot of reasons, but also because when push comes to shove in polls, when you poll on like particular really progressive kind of issues, public opinion is largely behind it, right? When you kind of aggregate things out, when you talk about policies, public opinion supports more progressive on issues on a lot of lines, right? So anything from racial politics to economic politics, it does have a lot of support. So I think that they could, but you're right, everyone's right about this narrow margin of people being so important.
I agree, Amanda, that national public opinion is forward. The problem is that we don't decide nationally. And so it's, I think I would be more inclined to, as my role as a distinguished advisor of the Biden-Harris campaign, to advise them to go forward on those progressive issues if state by state polling reflected those national trends. It, to the best of my knowledge, it does not. And so, it's the balance between being right and being elected. If they were, in my opinion, if they were to push for these issues, they'd be right, but they probably wouldn't be elected.
Well, and I wanted to highlight a distinction that I was kind of hearing between people, because, Mario talked about Americans, and we're talking about voters, and specifically eligible voters, and then specifically eligible voters in these key swing states because of, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And, one of the things that's so key in this election is voter disenfranchisement. And they've been, particularly disenfranchised in places like Wisconsin, right? So voters of color, people who have been formerly incarcerated, we just see a massive number of people who actually may agree, a massive number of Americans who actually may agree with these policies, and they've been prevented from voting. And that's before we sort of even touch with this absentee mail-in, kind of US Postal Service thing that's emerging. So there is kind of this dissonance because people are held back because they're appealing. I completely agree with Anantha that white women have always been the key to upholding the system of white supremacy. And, and they're also the ones who are probably perhaps the most enfranchised, the ones who have the easiest time voting. And so it's not only that they're, have this long historical legacy, but at this present moment, it is not their voting rights who are under threat, even though here we are commemorating on 100 years since suffrage. In some ways, their vote path has been paved for them, whereas people of color, working class people, undocumented people, or people who have had their citizenship questioned or rescinded, are in this really difficult position of not being able to use their voice in this particular way. Oh, yeah, that was more of a statement than a question. Yeah. Sorry, that kind of killed the conversation. Go ahead.
No, and these strategies are like playing with people's lives. There's people living this. So we can talk about these strategies and the fact that, people in Wisconsin are, kind of dictating my political situation here in the Bay Area, then I would much prefer that that's out there and it's honest, and we don't care about Black people, and we don't want Mexicans coming here anymore unless they're coming to pick our fruit. I would rather, let's get that all out on the table, and then people have to act accordingly. And if that's where we stand as a country, then all this stuff about the Black, it would be much clearer rather than this political games with people's lives. If we're having an honest conversation, we're not playing these games with people's lives, and we know as where we stand, and we're back to where we were in 1866, and it's like, should we leave or stay? If we're clear about where this country stands about folks who have been disenfranchised and oppressed.
Mm-hmm. I think that going back to this theme of unfinished work and the recognizing the anniversary of the suffrage movement and women winning the right to vote, and the fact that Harris opened her speech with that, but then to name the Black women who were a silent or less visible part of that movement, to read between the lines. I mean, this is probably my approach as a literary scholar, is to read between the lines of her speech. It's not something that she explicitly said, but I think one thing that we as a critical audience could infer out, whether that was her intended meaning or not, is that part of that in unfinished work of the legacy of the suffrage movement is to acknowledge, right, the way in which white women's voting rights have enabled white supremacy. And so, you know, I think that I don't know how to put it, but that opening up of that attention at the beginning of her speech, you know, I want to read a little bit of possibility there that, and I was really hopeful, Amanda, and when you were talking about that it is possible actually to push a progressive agenda and have the American people and voters go with you. You know, I think that's a little bit of a different model than I've assumed in the past. And maybe that's a condition of our current moment, where I think maybe people are more ready than they have been to go there. So those are just some thoughts off the top of my head.
Well, I thought it would be fun just to end with a very quick question about her husband, Doug. Like, we'll just shove him into the last 5 minutes, like like sometimes women in panels are shoved into the last 5 minutes. But before I ask my fun question about what it would mean to have a second man, does anybody have any other thoughts on her historic candidacy and sort of how she speaks or doesn't speak to this current political moment? Okay.
What was the question again? Say it again.
Well, I was just pausing for a moment to make sure that if anybody had anything else they wanted to say before I asked about Doug. Okay. Well, it's kind of a fun thing to think about, that a second man, right? And you always sort of, you know, see I always love when you see those pictures of world leaders, and then you see the pictures of the world leader spouses, and it's just Angela Merkel's husband is the only man in the spouse picture. So does anybody have any thoughts about what it will mean to have a second man sort of attending to so many of the unpaid labor that that first ladies and second ladies so often have done in the past?
Well, I understand you can't, maybe we shouldn't be judged, but anyways, the fact that he's a lawyer for Walmart and stuff says a lot to me about where she's at. You know, I know we shouldn't maybe judge people by their partner or whatnot, but it's hard for me not to take that into account when we're talking about how she actually feels about poor people and Black people and brown people and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
I mean, I tend to think that the tradition, I mean, not that there are that many traditional duties of the second lady. They're mostly accompanying their partner to their ceremonial events, which is how Dr. Jill Biden could do the amazing thing of teaching 15 units at the same time that she was second lady. Mm-hmm. Impressive on her own merits in terms of that regard. But, you know, jokingly, Bill Clinton said that he wanted to be referred to as the first lad if Hillary Clinton had been elected. You know, I think we'll see the same lack of level of engagement in that regard from a second lad, if there is one. Although I always find it funny that he never actually would have been referred to as the second lad, because former presidents are always president. So it would have been President and President Clinton had that happened. But fun facts of the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think it'll be interesting. Oh, Amanda, I cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, like, we haven't seen this yet. And I just want to, like, again, point out how ridiculous, right, it is that we actually haven't had a woman get to this level. So, you know, like, to even see what a second man, or whatever we're calling him, gentleman, spouse, it's just always been men, almost mostly white men, and then their wives, right? So like, we just haven't seen it. So I'm interested, but like Rebecca said, there's really not much that they do, but I'm just interested in kind of like the media optics of it too, just to see how they treat him. I was trying to look for information on him. And yeah, other than finding out about his, who he represents, which I had to do some digging and stuff, it was just mostly like, get to know Doug, or what's his name? Doug. See, I even forget. They're so, unimpressive, but yeah. So absolutely, we just haven't seen this yet. So, that in and of itself is a thing.
Well, I mean, I thought it was interesting. Up until very recently, the second lady or even the first lady wouldn't have had an employment history, right? I mean, so obviously Hillary Clinton famously did, and Michelle Obama did. But just the fact that of these potential conflicts of interest, or the connections that he'll bring, that he might bring into the White House, into the vice presidency, that is partially in relation to the fact that he is a man, and that he's had this long career, and that he's had an independent economic and political identity for a long time, and that's not always been true of our first ladies or second ladies. All right, well, that's enough about Doug. Well, I just want to say thank you to all of you. I really appreciate you joining us today and sharing your thoughts about Kamala Harris. And some people may actually be watching this video after she is already the incoming Vice President of the United States. So it'll be interesting to see this not only as sort of prescient, but then also as a historical time capsule, moving on and seeing how the election unfolds. So thank you to all four of you. I really appreciate you joining us today, and stay tuned.
Thanks, Sarah.
All right.
Thank
so
you.
Fatmir has been doing all of my editing, so I've had to now pause, and that's where we'll cut it. And then I just want to say an informal thank you to all of you.